My friends, when Jews pray, no matter where we are around the world, we face the city of Jerusalem. And for us in the United States, that direction is east. But what if we happen to be in Jerusalem? If we happen to be in the holy city, we face the place in Jerusalem where the great temple once stood. And what if we happen to be right near where that great temple stood, standing within what was once the temple courtyards? Well, then we face the innermost part of the temple, the holiest part of the temple, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, the area in the temple that was so holy that only the high priest would enter it, and only on Yom Kippur, on this day, in conditions of complete purity, the details of which we read in today's Torah portion. And what would the high priest have seen there? It's a question that's rarely asked. The temple's been destroyed for 2,000 years. Authors, filmmakers have endeavored to portray the mystery, the majesty of this sacred encounter. But we need not refer to Raiders of the Lost Ark for an answer, because what the high priest would have seen in the Holy of Holies is preserved for us in the Torah. At the very center of the Kodesh HaKadoshim was the Aron Kodesh, the Holy Ark. And it contained within it the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. And immediately above the Aron Kodesh was the Kaporet, a golden slab adorned with 2 golden statues that were mirror images of each other, 2 winged beings called Kruvim, cherubim in English, Kruvim, and the Torah is specific. The Kruvim shall have their wings spread out above, shielding the cover of the ark with their wings. They shall confront each other, the faces of the Kruvim being turned toward the cover. And it was beneath that canopy created by these wings that God's presence was said to dwell. In the Torah, it expends verse after verse, explaining the materials, the dimensions, the facade, the building logistics of this holy space, leaving out one odd detail. What did these angelic winged creatures look like? Could they have been faceless? And then the Talmud. In the Talmud, Rabbi Abayu, he answers it for us. Mai chruv, amar Rabbi Abayu, kurvaya, sheken bebavel korin le yinuka revaya. The singular word of kruvim, the word kruv, it actually means kurvaya, like a child. In Babylonia, one refers to a child as a revaya, said Rabbi Abayu. He's referencing a Masara, a tradition, that the Kruvim indeed had faces. They were the faces of children. And thus, when Jews turn in prayer towards the holy site of the Holy of Holies, we are facing the site of the 10 Commandments. We are facing the place where the presence of God used to dwell. We are facing a place that was adorned by the faces of children. Could we expect otherwise? Are not children our Holy of Holies? Are not children the ones who are most full of the purity, the hopefulness, the optimism, the potential for making our world even more sacred? The Holy of Holies was the innermost part of the temple, and in the present, rings of Jews, we encircle that site every day from around the world, turning towards it, placing it at the very center of our communal concern because of how much we treasure and wish to protect what the Holy of Holies contained. We treasure the Torah. We seek to protect it. And we treasure children and seek to protect them. But something has gone terribly wrong. I attended the town hall meeting at the BB&T Center right after the Parkland shooting. I sat behind Alex Schachter's best friend, one of the 3 boys who delivered a eulogy at his funeral days earlier, and I use that term deliberately, boy. He was walked in by his family, his eyes just as swollen and red as they'd been 4 days earlier, almost as if he hadn't stopped crying. And I had a notepad with me. I wanted to jot down my thoughts throughout the experience. And as he turned into his row, I scribbled down a single phrase. He's so little, not short. It wasn't so much about his size, even though he couldn't have been more than 70 pounds. It was that his face, had it not been drenched in tears, his face, if you looked at him, you'd still be able to use the word cute. He hadn't outgrown that yet. He had the face of a child. I sat 2 seats away from Fred Gutenberg. His daughter was killed. He didn't sit down once during the 4 hours I was there, making the torn black ribbon on his jacket all the more visible. His jaw quivered incessantly, like someone about to burst into a sob, or someone about to explode into a rage. And for 4 hours, he neither sobbed nor raged, even during his now famous exchange with Senator Rubio. His jaw just continued to quiver, as if trying to figure out whether sadness or anger would eventually win out. And I think that's where most of us started, balancing between unprecedented sadness, untempered anger, everyone pointing a finger, trying to identify the cause for why we are where we are. And the pointing gave us a sense of purpose. Identify the cause, fix it, solve the problem. But as I sat listening to students and parents and politicians at the BB&T Center, as I continue to listen to those same voices today, months later, I'm hearing people finger point causes beyond the literal smoking gun. I am a rabbi. I'm not a legislator. I'm a spiritual leader, not a politician. I'm a commentator on the soul, not on the differences between magazine sizes and the definition of a bump stock. The outcry for more sensible gun laws was expected, and something needs to change quickly. But we are falling short for our kids beyond not fixing our gun laws. And on this sacred day, we need to acknowledge a certain sense of accountability for what's happened to our society and pledge to move towards a solution. While listening to the students and the parents at the BB&T Town Hall meeting, I was surprised. The conversation moved past gun reform very quickly. Parents and students, they were also demanding metal detectors, fortified barriers around schools, bulletproof, reinforced glass on every window. In short, part of the fix that night, part of the fix still to this day, is turning schools into fortresses. How did we get here? In a single generation, the security measures that once inspired mass migration out of a school district, because who wanted to send their kid to a dangerous school that needed a metal detector, are now prerequisites for a parent. How did we get here? How do we get to the point that when parents interview preschools like ours, they ask questions about active shooter drills? How did we get here? And there's a related and equally disturbing epidemic plaguing our children today. Suicide, which overall is at its highest rate in a generation. It's raised 2% a year since 2006, but even more disturbing, for children between the ages of 10 and 14, that number's increased 300% since the 90s. A few years ago, suicide prevention programs in Broward County were implemented for 11-year-olds. I did not know the word suicide when I was 11 years old. What has changed in 25 years that has led young people to even consider the option of killing others or themselves? Bullying. Classmates of mine were bullied. In fact, the Parkland shooting inspired me to research the boy in my school growing up who was the primary target of bullies. He was teased mercilessly. He had significant social issues. He probably would have been placed on the spectrum had it existed when I was a kid. Kids abused him emotionally. They sang songs about him. They abused him physically. I remember one bar mitzvah, a group of boys had him in a corner. They were whipping him with a glow necklace like he was an animal. Didn't get easy for him in high school. I found him on Facebook. He's happily married with 2 beautiful kids. We all knew children like this. We may have been children like this. But being a kid has changed. When did mass murder and suicide become viable options for children? How did we get here? I've got a friend. He's a hematologist-oncologist, and he once noted to me the irony of blood cancers. The disease utilizes the very vessels that provide us life. Cancer circulates itself undetected via the pathways dedicated to our growth, our survival, our well-being. And I see the disease plaguing our society in the same way. The technology age has inspired unprecedented growth for our society, feeding us all life-altering nutrients. But it has simultaneously created unprecedented pathways for hate, meanness, judgment to circulate and infect. And blood cancers go unnoticed often. It takes a separate system to raise awareness about a larger problem. School shootings are a visible symptom. The fact that there's a statistic for suicide for 10 to 14-year-old kids, visible symptom. Just last week, it was revealed that 1 in 5 college students experience severe depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. 1 in 5. That's a visible symptom, making us all now aware of a catastrophic disease that has been eating away at us all, changing us all for a generation. And it was Elie Wiesel, it wasn't me. It was Elie Wiesel who said in his reaction to Sandy Hook, something has gone terribly wrong here. And it will be up to politicians to limit access to guns. But it will be up to clergy, educators, social workers, parents to acknowledge and address the moral and spiritual shift that has occurred in our society. That there's something contaminating it to the point where what a generation ago was reprehensible to a parent, metal detectors at a school, is now a prerequisite. That we've changed in only a generation into something which is unrecognizable. What are we to do? On this day we pray towards Jerusalem, towards the Holy Temple, towards the former location of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which was only entered on Yom Kippur, and which was adorned with the faces of children. Turning towards it, placing it at the very center of our communal concern because we treasure the Torah, seek to protect it, and because we treasure children and seek to protect them. And on this day, the air of the sanctuary, it's heavy with the spirits of the departed. A thickness descends upon us all as we cry out to parents, siblings, spouses, children, in our Yizkor prayers. And they respond back to us. From beyond the veil that separates the world of the living from that of the dead, we sense them, but we cannot understand them. We cannot decipher their response. We know what we want from them. We want a hug, a touch, even a nudge or a complaint. The soup's too cold, the trash needs to be taken out. We know what we want them back, even for a second, but we also know that's impossible. The question that we ask ourselves on this day is, what do they want from us as they peer upon this strange, unfamiliar world we've created, and they see that mean-spirited condescension, judging accusation, slander in all its forms is no longer atypical. It's become an acceptable form of communication. That the immediate reaction to confrontations or accidents or emergencies is not to intervene. It's not to intervene. It's to pull out a phone and take a video. Collect likes and shares at the expense of someone else's pain or discomfort. The air in this room is heavy with the spirits of the departed. What is it that they want from us? Perhaps it's just a transfusion of kindness. Historically, when the context of a society provides permission to behave poorly, society complies. And our online society encourages narcissism, vulgarity, untempered and uncensored judgment and criticism at the expense of kindness and decency. We've been given permission to opt out of kindness. To opt out of kindness. My friends, the selfie is more than a picture. It's a state of being. And our kids don't know of a world before the selfie. Before society became a personification of the selfie. Everything directed inward. Maybe all those who look in on us today, maybe all they want from us is to turn our proverbial phones around. To be part of the solution, not the problem. And the solution is to remain consistently kind and decent. Not kind when it's convenient, not kind when it's advantageous or self-gratifying. Consistently kind. And it sounds so simple. It's a cliche, practically. Turns out I'm not alone in speaking about this year. Just last week, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove of the Park Avenue Synagogue in Manhattan, one of the most influential Jewish voices in the United States, he didn't mince words. I imagine someone thinking, he said, Rabbi, for this you went to rabbinical school, to tell us to be kind? There are people in this room, but once a year. Tell them to support Israel. Teach them to light Shabbos candles. Encourage them to give to Jewish causes. With such a small window, this is how you're going to allocate your leadership capital? Being decent and kind? My answer, he said, yeah, support Israel, light Shabbos candles, give to Jewish causes. But there is no more important message for you to hear this year. Ma Adonai doresh mimcha. What is it that the Lord requires of you? Asked the prophet Micah. Ki im asot mishpat v'avat chesed v'tzneah lechet im Elokecha. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly before the Lord your God. That is the calling of the day. Unfortunately, that simple request to combat the malignancy seeping into our homes with a transfusion of kindness is incredibly hard to implement. A group of rabbinical students, they were recruited for a study on religious education. One by one, they enter a room. They're told to complete a questionnaire about why they decided to become rabbis, what inspired them, how they endeavored to inspire others. Half were told to prepare a 5-minute presentation on Shabbat. The other half, a presentation on the importance of gimilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. And their presentations were to be delivered 30 minutes later at an adjacent building. And on the way from building 1 to building 2, each rabbinical student encountered a man in the street, slumped over, eyes closed, coughing and moaning, because that was the study, to determine who would stop and help him. Would those rabbinical students primed with preparing a presentation on acts of loving kindness be more inclined to stop and help the stranger than those whose minds were preoccupied with Shabbat? We would think, yes, of course. Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, the illusion that something that has recently come to our attention suddenly appears everywhere. It's hard to think of a context that would contribute more to increasing kindness than having someone prepare a speech on kindness. It had zero impact on the future rabbis. The only thing that mattered in the study, this is amazing, was whether the students were told they were late for their presentation. If they weren't rushed, regardless of whether they were presenting on Shabbat or Chesed, 63% of them stopped to help the hunched-over, coughing man. Told they were pressed for time, 10% came to the aid of a stranger. A rabbinical student, ordinarily compassionate, generally kind-hearted, someone dedicated to a life of service and selflessness, was transformed into a completely different person, into someone indifferent to suffering just by pointing to a clock. Forget about 10 years of social media influence and a raging Instagram page. Given the slightest permission, most of us take the bait and we opt out of kindness. We become indifferent, spiteful, judgmental, without even realizing it. We conform to the moral contours of our surroundings, and despite convictions to be kind and good, we're easily distracted. 1985, PBS's Frontline aired a documentary titled A Class Divided about a teacher named Jane Elliott and a 2-day experiment she conducted with her 3rd grade class called Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes. Some of you are nodding because you remember this. Many of you have heard about it. Mrs. Dunn was the 3rd grade teacher in my elementary school, and after watching the documentary, she immediately called one of her most active parent volunteers to help her run the program in her own class. Overjoyed at teaching her own mischievous child a powerful lesson in empathy, the parent agreed. You can imagine my surprise when a few weeks later, this 3rd grader found his mom and Mrs. Dunn standing in the classroom right before the morning bell, holding red and blue armbands, respectively. The blue-eye, brown-eye model was not going to work for a class of 90% Jews with dark hair and dark eyes. Red and blue armbands. The polite, soft-spoken, even-tempered, studious, good listeners were given red armbands, a Snickers bar, and immediately taken by my mom out to recess. The rest of us were given blue armbands, given a math worksheet by Mrs. Dunn. Soon thereafter, we competed against the blue team in a spelling bee. My opponent's word, like all those with blue armbands, was 1 syllable. His word was hat. My word was pneumonia. The blues were incessantly praised. They were complimented, while we reds sat frustrated in failure, and the favoritism, the partiality, it worsened as the day continued. So did the jeers and the taunts from the blues, the team comprised of the good kids, the sensitive, nice type. And by the afternoon, those with red armbands, we'd been emotionally broken down, reduced to sobs and whines. It's not fair. You got to stop the game. But it continued until the final bell, and it was traumatic. And it was probably one of the most valuable lessons of my life. Because worse than the organized degradation was the indifference of our classmates. Tears streamed down our faces throughout the day. If anything, they just piled on or said nothing. In the documentary, Jane Elliott admitted that the experiment shocked her. I watched what had been marvelous, cooperative, wonderful, thoughtful children turn into vicious little 3rd graders in the span of 15 minutes. All they needed, my friends, was permission to opt out of kindness and decency. Go scroll through Twitter, scroll through Instagram, scroll through the comment section of an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, or if it makes you more comfortable, the editorial section of the New York Times, or if it makes you more comfortable, the Washington Post. I don't care. Just look at a comment section. Turn on a political debate. Open the most popular videos of the day on YouTube. We've been given permission to communicate and behave in ways unthinkable a generation ago. At some point, it became culturally acceptable to be mean. Our leaders are also symptoms, not causes. It was Harry Truman. Harry Truman said, "We get the government we deserve, and we deserve the government we get." The blue-eye, brown-eye lesson, the revolutionary study of seminary students, which was actually conducted at Princeton University by Drs. Darley and Batson in 1971 with divinity students, not rabbinical students, but they all arrive at the same conclusion. It's easy to be kind when it's convenient, but context upends even the most sincere of convictions. It transforms us without us even being aware of it. As Martin Luther King taught, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. And 2,000 years before that, our Mishnah was just as emphatic. "B'makom she'ein anashim hishtadel liyot ish." In a place where there's no humanity, strive to be human. A more appropriate translation: in a place that ceases to be kind and decent. Strive to be a model for kindness and decency. And it's possible. It's possible for each of us. Our kids need it. Our grandchildren need it. Our moral compass can be unaffected by the tectonic shifts around us, to be decent in an indecent world, to rebel against the undesirable manners and behaviors okayed by Twitter and Instagram. Politicians, pundits, actors, athletes, with a transfusion of unrelenting kindness and decency, it's possible to opt in despite the permission to opt out of kindness. Battle of the Bulge was in its third week when the 87th Infantry Division entered the fighting in Belgium on December 29th, 1944. David Bushel was his company's lead scout, responsible for straying far enough into enemy territory to draw fire and reveal opposing positions. He was on the front lines when a skirmish broke out at close range, and he and a dozen other GIs were eventually surrounded, overwhelmed, and ultimately captured. The GIs were lined up and held at gunpoint when a Nazi commander, gun in hand, stepped forward to deliver their fate. And he moved one by one down the line, standing nose to nose with each GI as if engaging in some sort of sadistic staring contest. And then he stopped at David Bushel. Whether it was 3 seconds or 10 minutes, it was the longest stretch of time of his life, broken up only by the commander leaning in even closer, pressing his lips right against Bushel's ear and whispering, "Take off your dog tags. I know what you are. Take off your dog tags." And then the commander walked away. And that night, Bushel ripped off his dog tags, which had on them his name and an H for Hebrew in case of burial, and he threw them in the woods. When a jeep carrying SS henchmen arrived the next morning, they asked only one question of the American prisoners: "Juden? Jews?" David Bushel stayed silent. So did the Nazi commander who captured him. Instead of being executed in a nameless field, his name added to the 6 million, David Bushel would spend months in a POW camp, just as long recovering in a hospital once the war ended. He would go on to have children, including B'nai Aviv congregant Karen Zal, grandchildren who I met. David Bushel was laid to rest on August 14th, 2018, 73 years after the most unlikely of people whispered into his ear and saved his life. And I'm haunted by why he did it. Since first hearing that story, that single line, "Take off your dog tags," has kept me awake at night. And I knew I needed to share it with you on this day. But because I am uninterested in humanizing Nazis in any capacity, somehow downplaying the culpability of an entire geographic region for the destruction of European Jewry, I struggled with why I felt compelled to tell it to you, struggled until I realized that the story of David Bushel illustrates the extreme example of what it means to remain decent and kind when society gives permission to behave otherwise. Divinity students, rabbinical students, third graders, millennials. Turns out being consistently kind, unaffected by context or conformity, is unusual. As the story of David Bushel testifies, it's even extraordinary. That is exactly what I think is being asked of us on this day as we cry out to the souls of the departed. Ki im asot mishpat va'avad chesed atznea lechet im Elokecha. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly before the Lord. It is not just the calling of the day. It is an antidote. It is an antidote. The technology age has given us permission to love ourselves to personify the selfie. And today is about turning the proverbial phone around and committing to once again loving others. Despite giving permission to opt out of kindness and decency, we must pledge to opt into kindness. Today we pray towards Jerusalem, towards the Holy Temple, towards the former location of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which was adorned with the faces of kids. And we must pray with a sense of purpose and obligation. As the air thickens with the spirits of the departed, we must affirm our commitment and our sacred responsibility to safeguard those children who are their descendants. I ask you all to please rise as we prepare for Yizkor.